It really now gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the reason why all of us are here this evening. And that is to hear a person speak, Justice Albie Sachs. For me, it was crucial that I have Albie with us tonight, because as you can see from the video, it is Temple Israel Heritage Center's dedicated purpose to honor the dignity of every human being, to stop that degradation, and to fulfill our incredible Constitution's wishes that everyone be treated with dignity. Justice Albie Sachs, I'm sure you've all read his CV, which we sent out to you, but I would just like to mention a few facts. Even from a very young age, I believe that Albie, he insists we call him Albie, was a born activist. Today, they believe that the passion that moves your heart is actually in your DNA. It's being proven by nanotechnology, even as we talk. And Albie came from a family, his parents dedicated to righteousness. And therefore, he grew up already knowing his purpose in life was to fight for justice in a country where the vast majority were not free, could not live in dignity, didn't even have the right to vote. And after getting his degree at Cape Town University, he immediately began helping those who had judgments against them because of our harsh laws. Ultimately, of course, he was a target himself and spent time in solitary confinement and ultimately had to flee this country just to stay alive. And he went to the UK, into England, and spent, I think, 10 or 11 years there teaching law and also studying it. After that, he went to Mozambique, Maputo, and from there worked already together with Oliver Tambo and others on crafting the incredible country and the constitution that was to be admired by the whole world. And was it Albie 1988, that Albie was the victim of a horrific car bomb attack in which he lost his arm and the sight of one eye. And I thank God, Baruch Hashem, Albie was saved because he was born to the destiny of helping South Africa become a constitutional democracy that is admired throughout the world. But for me, Albie contributed towards what is the most important aspect of our country, an aspect that we seem to have lost sight of in the last 10 years or so. And that is, he is the walking, living testimony of Ubuntu. No matter whom Albie meets, when you look in his eyes, he sees you. He has this deep sensitivity and understanding for the other. And therefore, Justice Albie Sachs, Albie, it is my great honor to now hand over to you and to get your words of wisdom, a wisdom that comes from such a deep place of integrity and honesty and compassion for the other. Over to you, Justice Albie Sachs.
Thank you, Reva. You mentioned that I went to England. You left out the fact that I was a refugee. And the first time I arrived in England as a refugee, I was a psychological wreck. I'd been in solitary confinement, locked up in this concrete cube for 168 days, the first time, and I survived. I didn't break down. When I was released, as suddenly as I'd been detained, I put on my khakis. The South Africans will know the word khakis. And I ran from the center of Cape Town through the center, past Greenpoint, past Sea Point, to Clifton, and threw myself into the sea, feeling joyous that I'd survived, but something broken inside. And 2 years later, I'm locked up again. And this time I'm subjected to torture by sleep deprivation. And I collapse on the floor and water's poured on me. I'm lifted up, my eyes, eyelids are prized open by the thick fingers of Captain Roy Swanepoel. I collapse, pick up, collapse, and something also breaks. And another 3 months, and I decide to leave. I didn't have to climb through barbed wire fence. I didn't have to get into a refugee boat. I got a Union Castle line. In a sense, even as a refugee, my white skin, being an advocate, gave me privilege. So I traveled in comfort. I played ping pong. I think I was runner-up of the Tennecoits, Union Castle, Cape Town Castle, Cape Town to Southampton in 1966. But I'm a refugee. And the first days were just wonderful. I remember going up to Hampstead Heath and lying on that soft grass. You know, South African grass is prickly, but it's soft, soft, soft grass. It would have been July, midsummer, seeing the kites flying. It's just so marvelous to know that I can just lie there. I'm not going to be arrested. I go to sleep at night, the doorbell's not going to go. It's just like amazing just to breathe freely and not to have the intensity of living 24/7, 12 months a year, year after year, that constant threat and sense of dread. And the phone listened to, the car interfered with, the mail interfered with. It was amazing. It was fantastic. I'd escaped in that sense from the harshness of South Africa. And yet some of the emotions, even for a privileged person like myself, I could spend time just reading, catching up on reading, getting funding for a PhD at Sussex University, meeting people like yourself in England now, helping me, and in a sense feeling extremely grateful and deeply angry. I'm angry with Britain. I'm angry with this country that's receiving me and giving me the possibilities of escaping from the harshness. And I'm angry, and I'm saying it's the British Empire that created apartheid in South Africa, that Britain trampled all over our continent, that British laws were used to colonize our people, that British investment was the source of the migrant labor system, the harsh administration. And I realized this is crazy. Britain is receiving me, and yet I'm projecting my anger onto Britain. And I think this is something that even I, the privileged white advocate with the possibilities of getting support and working on a PhD, even I felt that anger. And I see that anger in the people from Burundi and elsewhere who gave an interview early on. And it's partly your displacement, your helplessness. The fact that your country is not the country that's providing you security. Your country is the country that's threatening your security. And you're dependent on the goodwill, the benign perception from the country that you're going to. So I spent 11 years in England. I married Kemp, who'd also been in prison in South Africa. We had 2 children who grew up there. I got my PhD. I wrote books. I was on BBC 2 the first night when TV in colour was on in England, and they wanted this South African couple to participate in the news. And yet I felt a sense of displacement all the time. Marvelous people in England. Strong anti-apartheid movement. I'm carrying on, but always that sense of bitter internal anger, the country that conquered the world, the sun never sets on the British Empire, and as an Indian patriot said, in the time of the anti-colonial struggle, the sun never sets and the blood never dries. And yet, the country that is favoring me and supporting me and enabling me to have those thoughts without being arrested is the country I'm angry with. The second time I arrived in England as a refugee, I was a physical wreck. As you mentioned, I'd been blown up in Mozambique. Lost my right arm and the sight in my left eye. And I think I was the only person on the books of an organization called Society for the Protection of Science and Learning. It had been set up in the 1930s, 1933, to receive refugees from Germany and then from Austria. And I'm the only one on their books twice, because I'd come once as a psychological wreck, slowly recovering, and then 11 years later as a physical wreck, having been blown up. So they often ask me to speak. It's now called CARA, the Center for Refugees at Risk Refugees. And I'm happy to speak to them. In that sense, what you're doing in Hillbrow is part and parcel of a worldwide movement, even if you don't have the connections, of people who care and who are concerned, and whose meaning goes beyond what you can imagine. Because the support I got wasn't just some money from the Roundtree Charitable Trust to do a PhD, the space to work. It was the sense of that they cared, that they were concerned. Not doing it simply because it's an international obligation, thou shalt, because they felt it inside themselves. They felt maybe some of them had come from families that had been bereft, displaced. Whatever the reasons, the motivation, it's that kind of organized kindness. But what was different and interesting in my subjective experience the second time was going to hospital under an assumed name, just in case the assassins tracked me down, because they killed people in hospitals through poison in Southern Africa. So in that sense, I'm even, to some extent, in hiding as a refugee in the hospital bed as I'm recovering in London. And the nurses were cleaning my body, washing my body. And it gave me a sense of connection with England I've never got in my 11 years earlier than that. A kind of organized love through the National Health Service. So that from being grateful, I developed a love for the country that I hadn't had before. I appreciated being there very much. And I had marvelous friends there and great support in the anti-apartheid struggle. But now it was something different. It was those hands on me. I still remember the one nurse, she picked out a little bit of shrapnel from my chest and she said, let's get rid of this rubbish. And I said, don't call it rubbish, that's my car. And we had a kind of a laugh at that. But it was that laying on of hands and the physical attention and care that what I call organized love, the physiotherapist that got me to stand and walk, that gave me a connection with Britain that I hadn't had before. In Mozambique, and I might mention I was stateless for 7 years. I had that thing of getting documents. Every time I traveled, I had to get a visa for each country I went to. I couldn't vote. But I was super privileged because I could move around and publish and write and learn. And all the time while I'm a refugee, I was saying to myself, I'm not an exile, I'm living in exile. I'm living in exile. Living in exile means you take what you can from the country you're in, you give what you can to the country you're in. With that knowledge, I'm coming back, I'm coming home, and I'll take with me, in my head, my heart, my understanding, everything that I can absorb in the UK. I know I'm a South African living in the UK and preparing myself for the return. It was so powerful for me. And in Mozambique, a whole different experience, another 11 years on African soil, with all the turmoil, the joy, the excitement, the revolution, the change, the vivas, the songs, the long live the just struggle of the South African people, long live the emancipation of women, down with tribalism, regionalism, down with racism, very, very progressive and positive, and yet it couldn't be sustained, and civil war. And now there are so many people without legs, I'm without an arm, lost to landmines, child soldiers, a country torn apart, but also themes of what they called Mozambicaneity. Being Mozambican meant you absorbed from all the cultural inputs, all the peoples who lived there, you absorbed everything to create that Mozambican mix, and I brought that back with me. I brought back a love for public art, for murals, which they had on all the walls over there. So our Constitutional Court today has beautiful art. I brought back an energy and a spirit. Every institution had its own choral group, its cultural group. I, who'd never been in a choir in my life, got the people working at the court to set up a choir. And when Vanessa and I got married in the Constitutional Court, the choir danced us in African style. I brought so much with me from Mozambique. And it made me see refugees not simply people who are recipients of a kind of charity and help, but living human beings, carrying culture with them, bringing ideas with them, music, cuisine, style, clothing, ways of seeing things. And when they return to their countries, if they can return to their countries, taking so much with them. In my case, the Society for Protection, Science and Learning had people on their books. One of them, his first name was Albert, like mine, and his second name was Einstein, had been one of the persons on their books. Another one was Sigmund Freud, had been. And these are some great figures who ended up in Britain, who helped to spend some of their time in Britain. Einstein went to the States afterwards. But they are the great pollinators, the cross-pollinators of the world. So many refugees in that way. And how many of us don't know people from Zimbabwe, from elsewhere in Southern Africa, who haven't enriched our lives in all sorts of ways, with a certain style, a way of doing things that made South Africa a better country. The last part of my story, and perhaps this makes my situation unusual, is I'm sitting as a judge, Justice Albie Sachs, not Albie, just Albie Sachs, on the Constitutional Court, not wearing a Madiba a silk shirt, but wearing my robes. And it's the case of the Union of Refugee Women, brought in, reaching the Constitutional Court, a challenge to a piece of security legislation, national legislation, that said that only South Africans and permanent residents can join security institutions and act as security guards. And as you know, so many of the refugees end up as security guards. Some of them are highly qualified people, but that's one job that they can get. And I think they are welcomed because they need the job and they work well. And they become part and parcel, if you like, certainly in large portions of the seafront in Cape Town. You find people from all parts of Africa working as security guards, and by and large popular with the local residents. And now there's a blanket ban, and it's being challenged in court, and it comes to the Constitutional Court. All the judges were agreed that the blanket ban was too sweeping. The administrative apparatus for applying it, you could apply for an exemption, made it unconstitutional because it was an opaque language that people couldn't understand. It meant you saying you can apply for exemption, but in reality, there's little chance of you getting it. So we all agreed on that. Two of my colleagues took a stronger pro-refugee stand than I did. They struck down the whole of that blanket ban, saying that this was now discrimination on grounds of national origin of birth against refugees. So they were stronger than I, the ex-refugee. I felt that it's permissible to have a law constitutionally that said for certain very intensely important security areas, guarding the president, guarding important installations, you could have a requirement of citizenship and permanent residence. Because with that, you can get a police record. Otherwise, as refugees, there's no police record. You can't get the record from your home countries. So I didn't strike it down as a whole. But what was interesting for me was to look at the legislation and to see that we have excellent legislation in South Africa. And it's partly because so many people in our first parliament had been refugees themselves. And that's granting the right of asylum and also the right to work. It's a right guaranteed in international law and by international law and in our legislation as well. We didn't go the path so common elsewhere in Africa to set up tented camps. So the refugees come and they live in the community and the law is excellent. What's not excellent is the administration. There's been horrible abuses. People have to struggle and fight all the time. And that's where people like yourselves, Reva, and others are so important. Even if it's just helping one or two or three or four or five individuals, it's enormously meaningful and helpful to them. So I'll conclude then by saying, if I support the work you're doing, it's not simply as a human being, as a South African, as a former freedom fighter, it's as a former refugee. But if I do that as well, it's because of my acknowledgement of the price Africa paid for our liberation in South Africa. The bomb put in my car didn't kill me, but a Mozambican died of those injuries. And the war that was provoked in Mozambique because they supported our freedom struggle became a bitter civil war with child soldiers, with millions of refugees fleeing the country and internal refugees. The economy wrecked and destroyed. We complain about the outages, and of course we all feel angry and upset about them. The electricity lines were being bombed all the time in Mozambique, and be without electricity and lights for days on end. And it didn't just mean without electricity, you couldn't get petrol because the petrol pumps weren't working, all because they supported our freedom struggle. And when a Mozambican is stabbed to death because he's a Mozambican, to me, it's a betrayal of the support that they gave us. Angola was also smashed by civil war. And the whole of the Southern African part, the economies were wrecked and destroyed. They paid that enormous price. So we owe that debt, a debt of history, a debt of human sympathy and concern to peoples of Africa, but as human beings, to people from all over the continent, even countries that didn't suffer directly as a result of their support for South Africa. So it's really to say, when you asked me to speak and you indicated what the theme was, and when you showed me that film, Albie is here with you, 100%. May your work prosper, Reva. May you carry on with what you are doing. May that spirit that animated the founders of your progressive institution and shul, may that continue. I speak as a secular person, not as a religious person, but I feel what you express in religious terms I feel in my own language, with my own imagery, if you like, without the religious doctrinal foundations, but with a very, very similar set of convictions. Thank you.
Justice Albie, how can I ever thank you enough? Before we hand over to my co-chair for questions, I would just like to say that I really believe you are an epitome of every great religion, and certainly you are a walking example of Torah, of a man who walks humbly, who does justice, and has great compassion for other people. I think it was more than 10 years ago, in another era where Hillbrow still had a bit more vibrancy, we were honored to have the late Chief Justice Arthur Chaskelson give the address. Because the synagogue and the people, as you said, we're not talking about a specific religion over, we're talking about a universal attitude. The late Chief Justice Arthur, also your colleague who loved you so dearly, gave an address. And I think you are the epitome of Ubuntu. And for me, when I look at Africa, I see the heart of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam, of everything in that one word, Ubuntu. Because you're right, we owe them a great debt. And may your words, and I hope there are a lot of questions coming in the chat, David, but may your words also, and what you've experienced, help us to fight hatred of the other in the world. Today we have bombings of synagogues, of mosques, of churches in this era. And that's all because of what, Albie? Hatred, power, greed, maybe just fear. But what you've shared with us is a living testimony of overcoming so much to walk a path to destiny and help others live without that fear, to live in dignity. And just before we hand over questions, Albie, I think you'll be very pleased to hear that all four of the people who gave their testimonies to us that we shared, I'm in touch with them, and they too have remained against all obstacles and turned their lives around. And today, at least I know that two of them, our friend Tom from Burundi and Paul from the Congo with that lovely lady, it's amazing that they're devoting their time to helping those around them, South Africans who have less, who have nothing. And they are distributing, with the help of many organizations, they, the foreigner, the other, the stranger, is turning lives around by helping people with food, with necessary supplies. And to me, that's like your story. They walk in your path. They are at this moment, in this pandemic, they have become of service to others. And really, we're very honored. I don't know when before you've ever shared that personal testimony. And it's incredible. It's a testimony against all hatred, against all bigotry, against all who lack your compassion and love for humanity. And with those words, I'm now going to go back to my co-chair, Rabbi David Benjamin. David, may I thank you for that beautiful introduction. It took me absolutely by surprise, but thank you for your beautiful words about me. And perhaps then you may, I hope there are a lot of questions coming to you in the chat. And perhaps you'd also like to say a few words. And may I thank you too, not only for your lovely introduction, but being with me on this path to help the world become a better place and protect the human dignity of every living human being. Over to
Thank
you.
you. Thank you very much, Reeve. So I just want to invite those of you who are with us on Zoom. You're most welcome to submit questions. I suggest you do them in the chat. You can submit them to me, David Benjamin, and then I'll be able to. I'll look at them as we go along. So the first question I'd like to address to you, Justice Sachs, it's a kind of general question, right? First of all, an observation, which is, you know, about a year ago, probably if people had to rate the problems faced by the world, the most universal problems in the world, probably the issue of migrants, people migrating from one place to the other, xenophobia, that sort of thing, that probably would have been right up there, maybe very possibly a number one in the world, right? That's just over a year ago. Of course, everything then has been eclipsed by the COVID-19 crisis. But in actual fact, that crisis of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, etc., carries on. In fact, it's just become more acute because of the coronavirus problem. And of course, it's universal. We just have we basically concentrated here on the issue of, in the movie, on what's going on in South Africa. You gave us a different refugee perspective. But might I ask you also, with the perspective of a constitutional judge, what is reasonable to expect from countries in the world, from states, in terms of the way they relate to refugees, migrants, asylum seekers? Because we see it really just about everywhere. If you would relate to that. Now, up to you. Would you like to answer that question, or would you like me to add questions that have come?
Maybe take a few questions. There's often a lot of overlap.
Take a few. All right, so I have a question here, which is, where do you get your strength and resilience from? And I'm sure a lot of us are wondering about that. And I'd like to add to that another question, which is related, is how do you feel today in relation to your tormentors, the people who hurt you so badly in so many respects? You mentioned Captain Swanepoel, I think, for example. Perhaps that's enough to kick off with. Okay,
you know, as far as refugees are concerned, it's not even what's reasonable. It's what the law requires, and there's very strong international law on rights of refugees and duties of states, and that emerged from the catastrophic experience of World War II and the post-World War II period, with huge displacement. And then the Cold War intensified the sense of persecution and huge population movements. So states are under a legal duty in international law to receive refugees. And also, not just to give them, not to send them back, but to provide some kind of dignified life, which includes possibilities of working, and so on. What happens is states pass on their responsibilities to other states, and it's so important for collective positions to be developed. So in Europe, there's a huge battle going on, and I think European peoples have been conscientized to quite a large extent to be not only sympathetic in an emotional, moral way, but practical, and to create institutions and mechanisms for taking a certain number of refugees, but not just taking them in, certainly not putting them in tents or in camps, but finding places for them to live, to become involved in the societies. Then the further battle is, do they have to assimilate completely, shed their religion, their language, their culture? And the more progressive approach is no. You come in with your culture, with your religion, with your beliefs, you share it, but also you adapt to the local society in terms of the basic norms and standards of the country. And that's something that has to be worked out. And that's a source of great tension, not simply in relation to refugees, but to immigration generally. Where do I get my, you know, the one time I was in Israel, I was there just a couple of days. I'd been to a workshop in Gaza organized by the Kennedy School of Government on the rule of law. It was the year 2000. There was great hope of two-state solution at that stage. It was very vivid. And I ended up meeting Yasser Arafat in Ramallah on a Tuesday evening and sitting on the bench next to Aaron Barak in the Supreme Court in Jerusalem the next day. And the theme was the rights of Ethiopian Jews to settle in Israel. And Erwin Kotler, who became the Attorney General, Minister of Justice in Canada, was arguing for them as refugees and as Jews. And seeing me on the bench said, well, now I can go over to English. It made it a little easier for him to speak in English, taking advantage of my being there. And not that I had any role in the case whatsoever. So it's a very widespread international issue and problem, similar problems everywhere, but different contexts everywhere. My strength, I used to think it came from my dad, Albie Sachs, trade union leader, robust, strong at his, I was mentioning this in another webinar I took part in last night, at the crematorium in Golders Green in London, where many, many Jews were cremated, secular Jews mainly, who had come from Eastern Europe, fleeing, or from Central Europe, fleeing from Hitler. And Albie Sachs was living in that area as well, coming from South Africa. And Sam Khan, the Cape Town attorney, a brilliant attorney, said, I'm quite sure if God exists, Solly is arguing with him right now. So my dad was strong and forceful and independent and loved and hated and loved and hated arguing. But when somebody asked me after I'd been blown up, Albie, where do you get your resilience from? I realized it wasn't from Solly, it was from my mom, Ray, who was very self-deprecating. She was the typist for, she'd say, tidy up, Uncle Moses is coming. And Uncle Moses wasn't Moses Cohen or Moses Kantarovich, it was Moses Kotani, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and she was his typist. And when I asked her to dictate her memoirs after I'd come back from exile, she said, I'm not important. I said, Mommy, that's exactly why you must tell your story. There's so many people who are not important. They're not in the limelight. Their stories are not known. But I realized when I was asked the question you're asking me after I'm recuperating in Portugal, the qualities that saw me through were Ray's qualities, a certain kind of resilience. She never said a bad word against my father, although I don't think he didn't abuse her or anything, but he fell in love with somebody else and he wasn't kind to her. In all the years, she never said an unkind word about him. Only once she said, well, at least his hair was attractive. It was the closest she got in all my years with him of saying something negative about Solly. And it was her quiet resilience and lack of rancor and willingness to see the other side of people and generosity in people. I think that's what has stood me in good stead. And when it came to how did I respond to the people who'd done these things to me, well, Swanepoel died many years back, I think even before I got back to South Africa. And one shouldn't feel jubilation at anybody's death, but I felt jubilation that I'd survived. But When I'm a judge, 1996, I hadn't been a judge for very long. I get this call from reception, my chambers. There's a man called Henry who said he has an appointment to see you. I said, send him through. And my heart is really beating fast. Henry had phoned me to say that he had organized the bomb in my car. He's going to the Truth Commission. Am I willing to see him? And I opened the security gate, and there's this man, tall and thin like me, younger, and he's looking at me, I'm looking at him. And in his eyes, I can see, this is the man I tried to kill. And he can see in my eyes, this is the man who tried to kill me. We didn't know each other. We hadn't fought over love, a job. He was on that side, I was on this side. He tried to kill me. We're going to my chambers, and he's striding like a soldier. And I try and slow him down with my best judge's ambulation. You know, we men are always trying to be stronger than other men. And we talk, and he tells me about how good he was at school and university, Christian higher education, and rising in the army. He's telling me he's rising in the army to become head of the hit squad, one of the head squads. So I must pat him on the back for that. And then he describes the attack on me. He said it was actually initially meant for somebody else, but they hadn't taken my name off the list, so the bomb exploded. And I ended up by saying, Henry, normally when I say goodbye to somebody, I shake that person's hand. I can't shake your hand. Go to the Truth Commission, tell them what you know, and maybe we'll meet one day. And when we go back to the security gate this time, he's not striding, he's shuffling along like a defeated person. I forget about him. Working, end of the year, party in Joburg, band is playing. I go with a friend, and I hear a voice, Albie. It's Henry. It was made by, the party was held by filmmakers who were actually making Issy Dingo. I don't know if you were there at the time of Issy Dingo in South Africa, wonderful soapy. And he was one of only 2 soldiers who had gone to the Truth Commission. And so they were interviewing him, and he was at the party. And he's beaming, and he comes up to me, and we get into a corner so that I can hear him. The band is playing very, very loud, and he said, I spoke to Bobby Naidu, to Sue Rabkin, Farouk Timol, all working for the TRC. And I told him everything I knew, and he said that one day, and I put out my hand and I shook his hand. I almost fainted. He went away beaming. But I heard afterwards he suddenly left the party and he went home and he cried for 2 weeks. I don't know if it's true. I'm not even checking up to find it's true. I want it to be true. I'd rather leave it as a possibility than discover it didn't happen. But for me, it's more important that this former killer, for the sake of what he sees as his country, his cause for apartheid, can now cry because of what he's done. And it was liberating for me as well. He's not my friend. I won't invite him for a drink. Interestingly enough, when George Bezos, who was in the film, died, I got a phone call out of the blue from Henry, because George had been representing me at the Truth Commission. Strange hearing his voice again. But we don't go to a movie together. But if I'm sitting in a bus and he sits next to me, I say, Henry, how are you getting on? We're living in the same country. We're living in the same country. And he had to take that step himself. And I didn't ask him to say, sorry. How can you say you're sorry? It's ridiculous. But I wanted him to enter into the new South Africa, accept the norms and standards. The door was being opened for him now to tell the truth and become a more dignified human being, and he walked through that door. And for me, it was intuitive, it was instinctive, but it was strong. There's certain less of that abstract hatred out there in the world, threatening me, who knows, an enemy, the enemy. It's just this guy who's now moved forward a little bit, and I felt liberated by that experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've got quite a few questions now, so I'm going to have to exercise some editorial discretion. So I'm going to try and sum up what is the gist of several questions that I received. And I would say this, we understand that you have, at least before COVID, at least, have traveled the world, and you bring a message of, you know, the South African example and the part you played in it, and how it can be useful or helpful for other divided societies in the world. And I'm sure, speaking on behalf of, there are many people on this call who are in divided societies of one type or the other, and almost all societies are divided in some way or the other, some more than others. What tips can you give us? I know this is a very, there's not much time for this, but what message can you give us? What's the kind of message you bring to a divided society? What can they learn from South Africa, from the South African example?
Give me some more questions. Now, answers are long, so I'd rather give one long answer to a lot of questions.
Okay, so there's another question here, which is about your Jewish identity. To what aspect does that influence you? Do you reflect on that at this time? That's another.
Okay, one more.
You want to go with those?
Okay. Yes, I've been to Sri Lanka at the time when the Civil War was still on there. And the main theme I think I presented is restorative justice, reconciliation, looking into the eyes of the other. And they defeated the Tamil Tigers, but they haven't found the kind of political solution, the human solution yet. But I like to feel that the South Africans, and I've not been the only one going there, the people like Wolf Meyer and Ibrahim and others also spent a lot of time there. And it gives people confidence. If we could do it in South Africa, it seemed to be hopelessly impossible after 300 years of overt slavery, colonial, racist domination. People easily identified because they identified themselves in terms of their appearance and language and culture and so on. How could we possibly live together? That gives people hope and encouragement. It's a crude thing to say. My arm gives people encouragement because they can see I'm not speaking from an abstract way. I'm speaking from my own experience, telling stories. I visited Colombia 4 times in different roles on each occasion, and once went to Cuba to meet the FARC rebels. And there the main theme was restorative justice, to get peace. That justice doesn't only take the form of punishment, and that accountability doesn't necessarily have to take the form of sending people to jail or killing them or taking money from them. The other forms of accountability that can be more powerful, richer, more participatory, more inclusionary in character, inclusive in character. And it was quite emotional for me. I was sitting with Rolf Meyer, speaking to the Minister of Justice, whose father had been killed by the rebels. But maybe because of that, was very strongly in favor in Colombia of peace. And he asked me, how do you feel sitting next to Rolf Meyer, who was the Minister of Police, Deputy Minister at the time we were blown up? How do you feel? And I said, I feel fantastic because we are together now. I feel that's a huge achievement. And I think Rolf was very, very pleased, but I could say that quite honestly. So it's these sorts of messages that are helpful. Maybe the one area where what I had to convey had the biggest impact was Northern Ireland. And again, it was Cyril Ramaphosa, Wolf Mayer, played a critical role with the IRA, getting them to accept that they could achieve through political means, laying down their arms, what they were not getting through the armed struggle. And I spoke at one meeting. It was filled with former political prisoners, some the loyalists trying to kill the IRA, and some IRA maybe trying to kill British soldiers. And I couldn't tell the difference. They were working class Belfast people. Somebody told me you can tell the difference. The IRA all studied. Some even got PhDs afterwards into books. And the loyalists all went in for weights to come out physically strong. So you can tell. But I couldn't tell from the accents, the style, the voice. They seemed so similar. But again, speaking on my experiences, there's a little story that I think is part of that same theme. After I've been blown up, after I'm out of hospital, I'm working in the South African Constitutional Studies Centre in London, part of the University of London. There's a knock on the door. The centre was me. I was the centre of myself, if you like, but we called it a centre. And a very British voice said, gave his name and said, I've just spoken to the prisoners in a Longclash prison in Northern Ireland. And I spoke to the editors of the IRA Sinn Féin publication, and they'd received a copy of your book, The Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter. And they had a discussion, is it permissible for a freedom fighter to cry? And they decided by a majority of 3-2 that it was possible. Now, I was very moved by that. And I could imagine the three were the ones, like Jerry Adams and others, who wanted to talk. And the two were the dyed-in-the-wool fighters of an earlier generation who didn't want to talk to fight to the death. And now I'm telling this story, and I had 2 copies of our Bill of Rights that I wanted to give out, but I gave one to the organizer, and then I had only one, and I had 1 copy left here, sorry. And I said, I told that story, and I said I was embarrassed that I hadn't told this British guy how moved I was by the story, go back and tell them. So I didn't want to get caught up in IRA, ANC. This is very high level stuff. But I felt ashamed that I hadn't said anything. Now I'm saying it. And the organizer told me, you don't have to be embarrassed. Will the person come forward? She gave his name. And he'd actually got a PhD, he's published a number of books. And I was able to hand the 1 copy I had left of the Bill of Rights to him. It was emotional, it was personal. I noticed that Northern Irish men don't hug with the same warmth that even white South African men hug with. But it was that kind of contact, that humanizing contact that was so important. And I even proposed that Longclash Prison become like Robben Island, a center of pilgrimage, a place of study, which we hoped Robben Island would be. It's never become that. And even afterwards, Guantanamo Bay could become a similar place. Unfortunately, there's still prisoners there. But I think that is a goal one can look forward to. Turning the sword into a plowshare, the negative into the positive. I'm having a Jewish month. This is my 3rd Jewish, Albie speaking to largely Jewish audience as a Jew. And I've got 1 more that's going to be in England later on. And it's been interesting for me because it makes me reflect. The Jewish Board of Deputies asked me at the end of a very lively interaction with Professor Dennis Davis, Judge Dennis Davis, well, Albie, can you give us a Jewish view on the COVID pandemic? I said, no, I don't have a Jewish view on that. But for everybody there, that was very natural, because that's the way, that's the source, if you like, of virtue, being a virtuous Jew. And I've heard Muslims saying, what would a good Muslim say? Or what does a good Christian say? But I don't think of myself in that sense as a good Jew. And I'm very puzzled by what it means to be a good Jew, because Cyril Harris, with whom I became very close in those early years at the time of transition, gave the best presentation of the, the four religious people when Mandela was sworn in. They each given like 47 seconds, and they all take 53 seconds. And Harris gave the best. And I shouldn't have felt particularly proud, but I was happy that he spoke as well as he did. He looked like the prophet, and he spoke beautifully. But more importantly, at Joe Slover's funeral, he said Joe Slover was a good Jew. Now that surprised me. The head of the Orthodox rabbinate is calling Joe a good Jew, and cleared it only on ethical grounds. Years later, I'm staying, and I'm dropping a name here, with the Chief Justice of England in the new Supreme Court, Nick Phillips. He'd seen the jail diary of Albie Sachs, and he was curious, and we met at the conference. He said, when I'm next in London, I'm going to come and stay with him and his wife. And the day I was there was the day when the court had to decide whether or not the decision of the Jewish school to exclude the child of a converted woman was amounted to race discrimination under the race discrimination law. He said, I have to decide who's a Jew. He didn't give the Jewish shrug when he said that, but he could have done it. And the neatest egg dance I think I've seen in my life was somebody from the Jewish Board of Deputies who's been called as an expert witness as to what is a good Jew. He doesn't want to support the school, but he doesn't want to support the progressives. So he said there are three criteria for a good Jew. A good Jew will have a mezuzah in the doorway. A good Jew will contribute to Jewish charities, and a good Jew will go to shul at least for the high holidays. Joe didn't have a mezuzah, he didn't contribute to charities, and he certainly didn't go to school, to shul. Albie, exactly the same. So I don't know, I'm confused about what a good Jew means. But one side of me that is very pronounced is a horror at anti-Semitism. And I'm not speaking about the policies of any particular state, including the state you live in. I think that state is open to criticism like any other state, and there's strong criticism from inside the state about what it does. But the genocide marked me. And in 1968, I happened to be, I'd gone camping in Bulgaria, and we drove back through Czechoslovakia, and I'm in Prague. It was after the Prague Spring. And I'm with Stephanie Kemp, I was married to her then. And the people I was staying with, he'd been the Czech consul in Cape Town. We'd become quite friendly in those days. He said, maybe I'd like to go to the Jewish cemetery, which is not far from where he lived. And a very extraordinary place, because it was a tiny little ghetto, and it was like a hill, because for centuries the Jews had to bury their dead on top of each other there. That was impressive in a negative sense. But there were two little shuls, synagogues, and the guide pointed out that these shuls were filled with hangings that had been taken from synagogues all over Europe. because Hitler or Heydrich had declared that these would be a monument to an extinct race. And I went back to the apartment and I wept. And Stephanie said, well, why should you weep? We all affronted. It's horrible. It's gruesome. And I wept. And I said, it was a decimation of my family, uncles and aunties whom I'd never known. It's something in that sense visceral for me and very, very profound. So certainly as long as it's anti-Semitism, I will be proudly a Jew. What I say half jokingly, but only half jokingly, that what connects me with 3,000 years of Jewish history is Karl Marx, Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud, and my Auntie Rosie's taglach that I used to get every Rosh Hashanah in a big round tin. She made the best taglach in Cape Town. Millies took it over from her afterwards. They became rich, she died poor. But that was when our family would get together. And I'd meet my cousin Benny Rabinovitz and Jackie Rabinovitz and the other cousins, the Levines. And I enjoyed that. And that was fun. We weren't religious, we were secular, but that was part and parcel of my context, my culture, my background. When I went to the States afterwards, I would go to every kind of Seder, which you can only get in America, feminists, Seders, pro-Palestinian Seders, gay and lesbian Seders. And there, unlike in South Africa, where you have to choose your night and choose your company, they spread them out. So you can go to 5 Seders while you're there, depending on what your particular interest in. And I learned to say, when Moses was in Egypt's land, let my people go. I would sing it because I picked that up from Paul Robeson, African-American singer years earlier, with very beautiful, deep voice. And that would be my connection with the Seder, with the Pesach. But I don't identify historically. When I was in prison, the only book I had was called the Bible, the Torah, and the New Testament. And I was reading it for the first time. And I was looking for compassion, for love, for warmth, consolation, because you're on your own. It's terrible. It's awful. Doors are slamming. People are shouting, screaming. And I didn't find it. It was a very wrathful God. And people were being smitten. We smote the enemy down to every dog and chicken and cat. It was very harsh, very tribalistic, most of it, a hard, terrible story. Then the beautiful Song of Songs and Solomon and the period of David, some kind of consolation that I was looking for. And then the marvelous prophets at the end, Isaiah, and turning the swords into plowshares. They were down by the riverside, laying down arms. And that spoke to me quite strongly. So when Dennis, I was asked the same question last night on a program with Dennis Davis, and it's called the Lockdown University. To what extent, and Dennis had given a long explanation of his understanding, interpretation of the whole Exodus period, ending up emphasizing justice and compassion. He derived that from the Torah and from the Talmud. I said it didn't come from doctrine at all. They weren't part of my life. I was already in jail when I was reading for the first time. But I said it came from Jewish experience, not from doctrine, not from religion, not from text, not from that transmitted experience. And I said it might be something to do with our grandparents living in the shtetls, where the only book that they had would be the Torah. The only school they had would be the Cheder. Ideas mattered. I don't know if that's a Jewish thing, that ideas matter, but certainly for those of us who are activists, ideas mattered. Not just compassion, but ideas and thought and a kind of rationality connected with justice. Now, if that's part of the Jewish experience, then I'm imbued with that aspect. but the I don't know. I have a strange connection with rabbis. I was once in a room with the Chief Justice of South Africa, the Chief Justice of England, Jonathan Sachs, their spouses, and the widow of Cyril Harris. And I'm a proud Jew. I'm proudly secular. I don't know what the connection is. It's like between opposites, but maybe it's these things I'm speaking about, have come through, and they would see a Jewishness in me that I don't see connected with what they see as the sources of their Jewishness. So maybe there's something else that's at play here. So that's a kind of a stream of consciousness response to that particular question. I don't know if you can interpret it. You're the rabbi.
Thank you. Well, I can just share. Well, first of all, I'm curious. Something that has always interested me. How many people outside South Africa know what Teglach is? That's I always thought it was a universal Jewish food, but I'm not sure. I don't know how universal it is. Certainly we have it in.
I have to explain it. Does it have? I don't know if it's made elsewhere.
I don't know.
And Rugnach is definitely known in New York. Taglach, no. It's a sort of I don't know if it's got ginger. It's something a little bit acrid in it. It's a wrapped up dough. That's I don't know if it's boiled and then baked, and it has a very distinctive flavor. And she put raisins in, and truly, Millie's, that was a great delicatessen, Jewish delicatessen, Cape Town, got her recipe from her, and she ended up in poverty, which is something I was sad to discover later on. But Auntie Rosie and Uncle Eli, that was the place we all went to. And so in that sense, from food, it's a memory of aspects of youth and something that connects me up, if you like, with a history, a culture, a tradition, literally through taste.
Thank you. I don't know how much, I know you're very strong and resilient, but we've worked you really hard this evening. Perhaps just some closing comments, and maybe you'd like to say something. This has come up in the question, something about South Africa. How do you see things? What are you proud of? What are you less proud of? Do you want to leave us with some thoughts on that?
In the struggle days, we had bad people in our organization who abused their positions, be sick sexually, stole money, did bad things. And many were ambitious. And fortunately, the people like Oliver Tambo and Chris Arney and Joe Slover and Ruth First and the others predominated. There have been people who fought bravely for freedom, who in positions of authority and power, something happened. Very, very negative. It's extremely distressing to see that happening. More so for me than maybe anybody else, because I've seen those very same people, courageous and full of fun and warm and embracing, behaving in unconscionable ways. What I'm proud of in South Africa is our democracy seems to be well implanted. I used to say, democracy is not for Africa, it's not for South Africa. We've had 5 general elections, free and fairer than American elections, where it seems a lot of the laws being used to suppress voting. We want to encourage voting. We have a very lively free press. We have a commission of inquiry now that is digging out the dirt. Part of me feels horrified. Part of me feels elated. The dirt is coming out. What's awful is when the corruption, the state capture, these things are there, people know it's there, they feel it's there, and it's not being revealed, it's not being denounced. It's just regarded as normal. It's not regarded as normal. It's widespread, it's not normal. There's a big fight back against that. We've got, I think, a wonderful judiciary. It's not only in issues like this. When I met judges from the European Court of Human Rights in Kiev, I met two women judges, one from Ukraine and the other from Croatia. They said, you know, Albie, we're so excited to meet you from the South African Constitutional Court. On the European Court, we always look to the South African judgments first. I met a judge on the German Federal Constitutional Court, one of the top courts in the world. She said, we don't quote, we don't cite your cases, we always look at your cases. It's a modern court with a modern constitution dealing with modern problems. And it stood firm in this whole period. It's got very, very heavy cases before it right now. But it's meaningful because it's defending our democracy. And we have lively opposition and lively contestation inside the governing party. So these are things that please me. I'm also pleased at, I meet so many people, young people, who are right and thoughtful and challenging. There's something here. We've done something that's good, that people speak their minds. It's a very free, open society. It's not a safe society, and it's not an equal society, and it's not nearly as prosperous as it should be. It's a very free and open society. So it's these things, having the constitution, having institutions of democracy that are very meaningful and work, and having people speaking their minds, and meeting so many young people who are so bright and challenging and thoughtful, and the richness of our culture generally, the singing, the music, the dance, the movement, we're going to make it in film. We're not there yet. The vitality in that sense of South African society, these things continue to give me hope.
Thank you so much. I feel so incredibly privileged to have taken part in this meeting this evening, and I'm sure I speak for others who are here who have that same sensation. Really, Justice Sachs, I know you asked me to call you Albie, but my South African formal upbringing prevents me. But just thank you so much. But I'm going to hand over to Riva now, who I know wants to thank you profusely. So Riva, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Riva.
Thank you, David. I will take the privilege of calling you Albie, because you've meant so much to me over so many years in so many different ways, as a role model for my activism. Albie, we've got so many well-known people with us tonight, and there's one, David Lipchitz, who said he's always thrilled to talk to you now and again, and he sends you his regards. And, you know, I'd love to mention everyone who's with us. We've also had one of the Rabbi David Saperstein, and I don't know, he was the appointee in the Obama government representing religious, and he sends his regard. And Rabbi Stephen Fox as well, a wonderful chairman of our movement, and our local rabbis are with us as well. And if I mention all the names, I think we'll be here all night. But I would just like to say, before we conclude, that I think our example, albeit, of course, it's not perfect, we're still getting there, but of forgiveness is an example that everyone in the world, and you're quite right, we're fortunate to be living in a democracy as Israel and the States where there's still open press, and you're right, every government should be criticized. Without that, there is no going forward. However, may I just quote what Mandela said? He said, instead of vengeance and hatred, I chose nation building and reconciliation. And ultimately, you epitomize that. And ultimately, that is the only way mankind can survive. So I wish I had more words to say thank you. But everyone, they're all sending the chats. I think you'll see all the wonderful messages that have come on chat to you and to thank you. And I'd just love to thank everyone who is with us. And before we conclude, may I ask Jacob Hurwitz, who is our tech whiz, to let all the people open their cameras. So Albie, I'd like to say thank you, and I know they want to say thank you, and let's see all of our faces if we can do that, folks. If you can open your cameras. Jacob, can everyone open their cameras and can we fill the screen with them? Is that possible?
They're busy. They're almost all there.
Yeah, I know nothing about that side. I just hold thumbs and say, please, not too many hitches. And it's been wonderful this evening. Jacob, thank you so much for your work with us in this area. Still can't see all the faces. Can they fill the screen? Change the view in the top right-hand gallery. Right, folks? Can we change it to the gallery view? Voila. Wow. Isn't that fabulous? And there's so many people I know and love here, ex-South Africans and local people. And Albie, this is for you. These are the people who inspired me. These are the people you've inspired. And we're honored to have had such an intimate view into your soul. Your soul is universal in its goodness. And universal goodness is the heart of the Jewish religion. So with that, folks, what I'd like to say is, please help us at Temple Israel Heritage Center. Whatever ideas you have, we'll appreciate your support so much, be it financial or be it just being part of us and offering us your skills to build this platform so we can have people like Albie Sachs, who is really unique amongst the nations of the world in bringing forgiveness as well and reconciliation to justice. Please, you've got my email, we'll share it again. Drop me a line if in any way you'd like to work with us at Temple Israel Heritage Center. We're a completely interfaith organization, non-partisan, searching for peace and justice for all. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love you, not only financial, although that's the most important as well, but your skills, your idea, any passions you may have that we can represent on this platform as we have tonight. And Albie, with you as our role.
Your signal's failing.
Those of you who would like to, I think you should be able to open your cameras now if you'd like to do so. If you haven't, those of you who haven't managed to do so. If you, of course you don't have to, but it would be nice to see your faces. Jacob, in the meantime, there's the final slide we could put up. And just to let you know, the music you've been hearing is by a wonderful duo, a gentleman from New York who's a sax player, and a lady from Rwanda who plays a traditional Rwandan instrument, and they've allowed us to use their very, very special music. Jeremy Danneman and Sophie Nsayangza. So, and you'll be hearing that to play us out as well. So Riva, unfortunately, we seem to have lost her signal, but let me just add Justice Albie Sachs, thank you so much for being with us this evening. So if you're able to see the chat, then you'll be able to see many messages from people who are very, very appreciative of this event and your being with us. I think all of us will carry we will cherish the memory of this event this evening, and we all feel very, very honored and privileged to have been here. And just so you know, those of you who want to watch this again, you can watch it on Facebook. It's been streamed on Facebook and it'll be up there for a while. And you can also recommend to others who didn't make it tonight. They're very welcome, obviously, to tune in and watch this. I suggest you put the music on, Jacob. If people want to keep putting things in the chat, then they're most welcome to do so.